Hello? Okay. Thanks, Nikki. Right. I wasn't here yesterday, sorry. I had things going on in London. One of the things I did just in the evening after work was go to something called a Fail Fest. Don't start the slides yet. It's not part of I'm just making conversation. So, has anybody heard of that, this Fail Fest? Yeah. Jacob, I think, mentioned it a few years ago. It was actually it was really interesting. It was where people came together and talked about failure and actually really celebrated failure. And no, I'm just saying this because in the room there was a completely different dynamic. It was actually a bit wild and crazy. There was lots of whooping going on in the room. Honestly, I felt a bit uncomfortable with it. But but now that I'm watching all of you from the back of the room with utter silence, I'm thinking that we might need a little bit of. I'm not going to ask you to whoop. I'm not going to ask for that, but hopefully we'll pick up the dynamic just a little bit. So anyway, that was just what was on my mind. So I'm going to talk about conflict, communication in conflict. And if I say violent conflict, I think a number of images come to mind. You can start it now. There's a lot of rotate, so I'll ignore them. But things might come to mind like bombs, guns, soldiers, child soldiers. Some of you who are more active responders might think about first aid, clean water, tents, toilets. Others of you might think about feelings, about panic, confusion, grief, isolation, perhaps growing anger as well. And in conflict, people need to know how to stay safe, how to keep healthy, how to cope with some of those feelings and raise their spirits, just as they do following disasters. And they also need to tell relief workers what they need. They also need the space to share good ideas amongst themselves, in the absence of us, about how they're coping with the situation themselves. All of that really applies to disaster settings. And humanitarian communication really can play a role, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. It can provide practical guidance. It can help people feel connected. Media itself can reach no-go areas where a lot of traditional responses really struggle to access and reach. But what's different about conflict, about communicating in conflict settings? Just three things that I can think of just to get started with for all of us, really. One is that the communication landscape is distorted. So it's not just equipment that's broken, it's people's trust as well. So frameworks that people normally go to are broken. Propaganda and misinformation can be weapons of war. Local broadcasters can be subverted, and established mechanisms of word of mouth can be less reliable or forced underground. So we're really working with different contexts here. A second point that I think makes it different is that people's questions become more difficult to answer. So with natural hazards, there tends to be a clear beginning and a relatively clearer end point. And there's a moment when you can start talking about recovery. In conflict settings, when there's no end in sight, people's most pressing questions are, when will it stop? When can we go home? And those are questions that we most likely don't have answers to. That doesn't mean we shouldn't at least try to answer or at least talk with people. I think just giving people the space to talk through those answers themselves or talk through those questions themselves and simply come to terms with the situation can be highly valuable. A third point that I think is different with conflict is that often communication projects are requested to do... can you pause it? Because I'm actually way behind. We're getting a little... because only a few slides are relevant. But a third point is that communication projects are often asked to do peace building somehow. They're often asked to somehow slip in and incorporate peace building as part of what they're doing. I question how realistic it is to do peace building when we're talking about generations-old issues, when emotions are running high, and really when bullets are still flying, it's the heat of the moment. So I think we need to think very, very carefully about what is realistic in those settings. So moving on from those 3 points, I think we also need to acknowledge that there's a real lack of evidence about what media and communication can do in conflict, especially in the midst of conflict. So when you do get in front of a microphone in the midst of conflict, we don't have enough evidence to know exactly what we should be saying. What is the most helpful to be saying at that moment? One area where there appears to be real potential is around humanizing the other. So at least helping sides view the other as someone isn't human. Media lends itself very well to that by sticking to a humanitarian agenda, not addressing political issues. You can still broadcast the voices of people from opposing sides talking about shared suffering, talking about the same challenges and losses, and dealing with the same humanitarian issues. And I think that potentially can help. There we go, back to that one. The BBC, both Media Action and the World Service have been responding to conflict with Lifeline programming for decades now. And I'm going to talk briefly about 2 of our most recent responses to conflict, one in Gaza and one in Lebanon, which actually partly included Jordan as well. In Gaza, during the Israeli military offensive, which was exactly 1 year ago this week, our challenge was how to make programming that really resonated with people that were affected, despite the fact that we couldn't access the area. So what we did was partner with a radio station called Radio Alwan, and this was a station that we had been working with, training over the past several years before the situation. We knew them. We knew editorially they had really strong values, and we knew that they were quite well respected in the region. We produced programs with practical information, both about physical and psychological needs. In fact, the psychological needs were some of the most popular programs that audiences responded to. We broadcast them on local FM stations, on Alwan and Radio Gaza, also BBC Arabic, and we broadcast them online. They were available for streaming, and there was a surprising number of online listeners from Gaza, despite fuel shortages and all of that. Listeners were invited to respond to the program through SMS and social media, and they did a lot, and they asked a lot of questions for relief workers, for government officials, for local NGOs about how they could access services, how they could help themselves. It really was an absolute full menu of issues. We responded to those questions by then, in turn, interviewing people from those organizations that could, if not provide practical information, at least provide a response so that people felt that there was something of a conversation happening between them. Our evaluation research showed that audiences found it useful, objective and transparent, which was no small feat given the context. And I think that choosing to work with a single, well-trusted, nonpartisan radio partner, local radio partner, made all the difference in that. That was really critical in gaining that perception of trust and credibility. So now let's switch to Lebanon, where we know a lot of Syrian refugees have fled the conflict in Syria recently. Our challenge there a few years ago was how to reach these refugees who were scattered really across the country and in an area where local media would not meet their needs. The local media was Lebanese, and it wasn't within their business remit to make programs for Syrian refugees. We went there, we realized that one place where Syrian refugees were coming together were around UNHCR registration centers. So what we did was we set up screens, like the one you see there, at the registration centers, and we made a series of films, very informative films with some practical tips, as well as the softer side of things, dealing with domestic violence, how to handle high tensions running in family situations, children's education, how to continue education without schools and infrastructure. And our evaluation research on those films and that response was that people felt the information was very practical, very motivational as well. We featured some volunteers that were just picking up and trying to help their community. People liked seeing people like themselves, because a lot of times we use non-actors to do dramas, and there were a lot of documentary styles, so they felt very reflected in that content. They also said they wanted more local information. We were making these films for across, can you pause just for a sec? Thanks. And we were making these films across both Lebanon and Jordan. So there was a limit as to how local we could go with this information. And so in response to that, what we then did was a follow-up project, which is what you see in that picture, where we're setting up, right now it's still quite early stages, communication hubs in centers across Lebanon. And in these hubs, people can watch a series of new films again with practical information, access information on these tablets you see here, even in a private setting, and through a specially designed app that we made where people can choose to watch the films that they want to watch. If a woman wants to watch a film on domestic violence, she can do so in privacy. There are headphones as well. There's also a button where people can leave leave a short message as well, anonymously. They can leave their comments for the hub workers or anyone else. So they can do that. They can charge their mobile phones. They have access to free Wi-Fi. They can come in, chat to people, and they can also ask a real live person questions about service delivery there. The films themselves deal with issues that are straightforward, like clean water and how to cook safely, how to keep mold out of your tent, things like that. But they also really ventured into much more difficult areas, like local leaders who can really impede the delivery of aid. Also, really attempting to address the growing tensions between Lebanese host communities and Syrian refugees. So those two projects aside, finally, one thing that I do want to raise is, regardless of whether we're dealing with more factual information or more sticky issues around social cohesion, one thing that I think all of us need to do, or do better, is to conduct rigorous conflict analyses before we go into these situations. If we're using media and communication, which can also be used as weapons of war to distort the situation, we need to be very responsible and very attent as to what the impact of our media and communication initiatives might be, including unintended consequences. So now when you think of conflict, I want you to think about what media and communication can do. And I want you specifically to think about how we together can collect more evidence about what media and communication can do to help people survive, to help address the conflict, and to help people move on to lead better lives. That's it. Thank you.